I'd lived in the Whitcomb house for 31 years without a single boundary dispute worth mentioning. Then one humid morning in June, I walked out to trim the boxwoods along my east property line and found a stack of pressure-treated lumber sitting on my side of the survey pins. Pins I'd had reset myself in 1994. 14 inches of new bar deck, cantilevered right over ground that had belonged to my family's house since Calvin Coolidge was in office. I didn't yell. I didn't call a lawyer that afternoon. I went inside, made a cup of coffee, and pulled out the same 3-ring binder I'd used to fight off a driveway dispute back in 1997. 6 months later, a corporate landlord was out an 8-figure redevelopment plan. A preservation board chairman had resigned in disgrace, and the historic district I'd spent 3 decades protecting was safer than it had been in a generation. All because a bartender named Colin Ashford thought 14 inches wouldn't matter to an old woman who liked her flower beds. He was wrong about the flower beds. He was wrong about a lot of things. My name is Eleanor Voss. I'm 68 years old, a retired historic preservation architect. And for the last 31 years I've owned the Whitcomb House at the corner of Larkspur and 9th in the old Fenwick Historic District of Marion, Ohio, a designation the house has carried since 1978, 4 years before I bought it. The house is a Queen Anne Victorian, built in 1891 by a grain merchant named Corwin Whitcomb, with a wraparound porch, a turret on the northeast corner, and fish-scale shingle siding. I have personally repainted twice in the original heather gray and cream color scheme, because the historic district's design guidelines require it, and because, frankly, I think it looks better that way. There's a stained glass transom over the front door that Corwin Whitcomb supposedly ordered from a Chicago catalog in 1892, and I've had 3 different appraisers tell me, over the years, not to touch it under any circumstances, as if I needed to be told twice. I spent 34 years as a preservation architect before I retired. First with the Ohio Historic Preservation Office, doing survey work across the northern half of the state, then in private practice restoring courthouse facades and Main Street storefronts across 3 counties. I've testified at zoning hearings. I've written design guideline manuals that other cities still use as templates. I know deed language. I know zoning code. I know the difference between a variance and a special use permit, and I know it the way most people know their own phone number. My late husband, Richard, used to joke that I could recite an easement description in my sleep, and there were a few years there, raising our son and finishing my licensure exams at the same time, where that joke wasn't entirely a joke. I tell you all of this not to brag, but because it matters for what comes later. When I say I read a property survey, the way most people read a grocery list, I mean it literally. When I say I know how to find a document buried in a county archive, I mean I've spent entire summers doing exactly that for other people's houses, for a paycheck, long before I ever needed to do it for my own. I bought the Whitcomb house in 1994. No, let me correct myself, because dates matter in this story. I bought it in the spring of that year, 6 months after Richard and I moved to Marion for his job at the county hospital, and I had the boundary survey done that same year, specifically because the previous owner of 214 Larkspur, a cranky old man named Herschel Fontaine who ran the hardware store there for decades, had strong opinions about where his fence posts belonged that didn't match the actual recorded line. We settled that dispute amicably enough, with Herschel grumbling the whole time, and the survey I paid for then has sat in my files ever since, a quiet insurance policy I never expected to need again. The corner lot next to mine, 214 Larkspur, had been a hardware store under Herschel until he retired in 2003, then a bait and tackle shop for a few years after that, then sat vacant for 6 years, boarded windows and a faded for lease sign nobody seemed in a hurry to update, before a new tenant signed a lease in March and gutted it into a bar called the Anchor Room. I didn't think much of it at first. A bar wasn't my first choice of neighbor. I'd have preferred another bakery, if I'm honest, or a bookstore, something that closes by 9. But the historic district's mixed-use zoning had allowed commercial buildings on that corner since before I was born, and I've never been the type of person who thinks change is automatically a threat. Marion needed foot traffic downtown. Half the storefronts on 9th Street had sat empty since the recession, and I understood, in the abstract, that a lively bar bringing in customers on a Friday night was better for the block than another dark window. What I didn't understand, not yet, was that the building at 214 Larkspur had quietly changed hands 18 months earlier, sold not to a local buyer, but to a limited liability company registered out of Columbus, and that the modest little bar about to open next door to me was the first domino in something much larger. I found that out the way I found out most things that mattered in this whole ordeal. Slowly, through paperwork, well after the fact. I want to be fair to myself here. I had no way of knowing any of that in June. All I knew, standing in my yard with a pair of pruning shears in one hand, was that a man named Colin Ashford had signed a lease, hung a sign shaped like a ship's anchor over the door, and started construction on a rear deck that summer without pulling a single permit, and that the deck, whatever else it turned out to mean, was sitting on my land. There's a rhythm to my mornings that hasn't changed much in 3 decades, and I think it's worth describing, because it's the reason I noticed any of this at all. I'm up by 6, coffee on by 6:15, and out in the yard by 6:30, most days from April through October, before the Ohio humidity turns the air into something you have to wade through rather than breathe. Larkspur Street at that hour belongs mostly to joggers, a handful of commuters cutting through toward the county hospital, and me, kneeling in the dirt along the east property line with a bucket of tools that Richard used to tease me about, a hand trowel, a pair of Felco pruners I've owned since 1988, a kneeling pad that's outlasted 2 dogs and 1 knee replacement. Old Fenwick itself wakes up slowly. The bakery on the corner of 9th doesn't open until 7. The hardware store, a different one now, not Herschel's, a newer owner who kept the name out of what I assume was nostalgia, doesn't roll up its gate until 8:30. For most of the year, my boxwoods and I have the block to ourselves for a solid hour before anyone else is out, which is exactly the kind of quiet I'd built my retirement around, and exactly the kind of quiet a bar next door was, admittedly, going to test. The neighborhood itself has a longer memory than most people bother to learn. Old Fenwick was platted in 1887 as a speculative development for grain merchants and their families, riding the boom that came through when the rail spur connected Marion to the trunk line running north to Cleveland. And Corwin Whitcomb was one of a dozen men who built showpiece houses along Larkspur and the surrounding blocks in the 5 years that followed, each one trying, in its own fussy Victorian way, to outdo the neighbor's turret or gable or wraparound porch. Most of those houses are gone now, torn down in the 50s and 60s for parking lots and a strip of low commercial buildings that never quite thrived. But 6 or 7 survive along with the commercial corner buildings that anchored the district's working life, including the Fenwick Feed and Seed building that would, months later, become the whole reason any of this mattered as much as it did. I'd spent enough of my career reading about towns like Marion, losing this exact kind of block to exactly this kind of quiet, incremental erosion, that I suppose some part of me was always half watching for it, even before I had any specific reason to. That's where this really begins. Colin Ashford was maybe 40, built like a man who used to play college football and never quite let go of it, with the kind of easy charm that works great on regulars ordering a second round and works terribly on retired preservation architects holding property surveys. He'd grown up 2 counties over, worked a decade in restaurant management in Columbus, and told anyone who'd listen that the anchor room was the thing I've wanted to do my whole life, which I believed actually, and which made some of what followed a little sadder than it needed to be. He'd leased 214 Larkspur from the LLC that owned it, sunk what I later learned was most of his and Kristen's savings into the build-out, and was, by all accounts, in a hurry to open before the 4th of July, because a bar in a small Ohio downtown lives and dies by whether it catches the summer crowd or misses it. I found out about the deck construction the way I find out about most things in my own yard. I was out there in it. I garden most mornings before the heat sets in, hydrangeas along the east side, a modest vegetable patch out back, boxwoods I've kept clipped into the same shape since Richard passed, because it gives the days a shape too. That's the context for how I noticed. I wasn't watching Colin's construction site. I was watching my own hydrangeas, and his construction site happened to be 14 inches too close to them. On June 9th, I noticed a contractor's truck idling in the alley behind 214 Larkspur, and by June 12th, there was a wood frame going up along the back of the building. A deck, clearly meant for outdoor seating, with a shed roof overhang above it. I didn't think anything of it until June 16th, when I went out to deadhead my hydrangeas and noticed the new support posts weren't just close to my property line. They were past it. I keep my own boundary markers current. Back in 1994, after that dispute with Herschel Fontaine over the fence line, I'd paid a licensed surveyor named Frank Osei to reset the pins and file an updated survey with Marion County. I still have that survey in my binder, laminated, because I am the kind of person who laminates things. Richard used to tease me about it, said I'd laminate the dog's vaccination records if the vet let me. I walked the line with a tape measure that afternoon, kneeling in the grass in my gardening gloves, and confirmed it myself. The new deck's support posts sat 14 inches onto my side of the recorded boundary, and the shed roof overhang extended even further, nearly 2 feet into my airspace above the property line. I measured it twice, because I wanted to be certain before I said a word to anyone, and because 14 inches sounds small until you're the one whose flower bed it's sitting in. I went over and introduced myself to Colin that same afternoon. He was up on a ladder, screwing in roof joists, sweat through his shirt, a radio balanced on a stack of lumber playing something with a lot of bass. The whole back lot smelled like fresh-cut pine and asphalt from the alley beyond it, and there was sawdust drifting down onto what used to be a clean strip of my grass. "You're building on my property line," I told him. Not an accusation. A fact, the way I'd state the weather. He climbed down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at me with the specific expression of a man who has decided, before you've finished your sentence, that you don't know what you're talking about. "Ma'am, I had the contractor eyeball the lot line off the old fence posts. We're fine. The old fence posts were never on the property line. They were on the previous owner's side, about 1.5 feet short of it, which is exactly why I had a survey done in 1994. I held up my folder. I have it right here if you'd like to see it. Colin didn't want to see it. "Look, we open in 3 weeks. I've got a contractor scheduled. I've got a liquor license inspection. I don't have time to redo a deck over a foot of dirt." He smiled, the kind of smile that's supposed to end an argument. "I don't think this is worth getting worked up about." "I'm not worked up," I said, and I meant it. That's a thing people rarely believe about me in these situations, but it's true. I wasn't angry standing there in his half-built bar lot. I was simply someone who had just discovered a fact, the way you'd discover your car needed an oil change, and who intended to address that fact through the normal channels available to address it. "Well, good," Colin said, already turning back toward the ladder, the conversation over as far as he was concerned. "Because in my experience, these property line things have a way of working themselves out once everybody calms down." That was, I would later realize, Colin's first and most consistent mistake, assuming that not worth getting worked up about was a decision he got to make on my behalf, about my own land, and assuming that working itself out meant I would eventually decide to stop noticing. I went home that afternoon and did the thing I always do before I do anything else. I made a timeline, not a mental one, an actual one, on a legal pad, with dates down the left margin, because memory is a liability in a dispute like this, and paper isn't. June 9th, contractor's truck first spotted in the alley. June 12th, framing begins. June 16th, I measure the line myself and confirm the encroachment. June 16th, later that afternoon, conversation with Colin, refused. I dated every entry as I made it, and I kept adding to that same page for the rest of the summer. Because a dispute like this lives or dies on whether you can say, with total confidence, exactly when you knew what, and exactly what you did about it. Richard used to say I'd have made a good detective if I hadn't already made a good architect. I think what he meant was that I've never much trusted my own memory of a conversation over a dated note taken an hour after it happened. I gave him a real chance. I'm not in the business of ambushing people, and 34 years in preservation work taught me that most disputes get worse, not better, when you skip the step where you simply tell someone what you know and give them room to fix it. On June 18th, I sent him a certified letter, return receipt requested, because I wanted a paper trail from day one, enclosing a copy of the 1994 survey, a friendly cover note explaining the encroachment in plain language, and a request that he adjust the deck's footprint before pouring the footings any deeper or finishing the roof structure. I offered, in that letter, to split the cost of having Frank Osei's successor firm, Redline Surveying, re-verify the line if he doubted my documentation, because I wanted him to have no reasonable excuse to say he wasn't sure whose word to trust. That's not a hostile opening move. That's about as generous as these things get, and I've seen enough boundary disputes turn ugly over less generosity than that. He signed for the letter on June 20th. I know, because the receipt came back to me on June 24th. A little green card with his signature scrawled across it in blue pen, tucked into my binder alongside the survey. He kept building anyway. I watched it happen from my kitchen window over the following 10 days. The framing crew showing up at 7 each morning. The whine of a circular saw drifting over the hedge. Decking boards stacking up in the lot, like nothing at all had changed. Some part of me kept expecting a call, or at least a knock on the door acknowledging he'd gotten the letter. It never came. By July 1st, the deck was framed out, decking boards were going down, and the roof overhang was shingled. I went over one more time, not to argue, just to confirm he'd received everything, and understood where things stood. Colin was behind the bar, unpacking glassware, and this time his wife Kristen was there too, going through a stack of invoices. "We got your letter," Colin said, not looking up. "My contractor says surveys get contested all the time. We're not tearing anything out 3 weeks before our grand opening over 14 inches. It's not really a matter of contesting," I said. "It's recorded with the county. Everybody's got a piece of paper," Colin said. "I've got a business to open." Kristen added, without much warmth, glancing up from her invoices just long enough to make her point. "Maybe you could just let it go, given it's 14 inches. It's not like we're building a parking garage. It's not the size of the encroachment that matters to the county," I told her. "It's that it's recorded and documented, and you were notified in writing before you kept building on top of it." "Or," Colin said, setting down a rack of pint glasses with a little more force than the glasses probably deserved, "you could just be a good neighbor about it. We're trying to bring something nice to this corner. I'd think you'd appreciate that, given how much you clearly care about the block." "I do appreciate it," I said. "I'd appreciate it more if it were on your side of the line." Kristen set down her invoices at that point and looked at me properly for the first time in the conversation, the way people do when they've decided you're about to become a problem worth actually assessing rather than dismissing. "Do you have any idea what a survey correction costs a business 3 weeks before opening? We'd have to bring the contractor back, reorder decking, probably push our grand opening back a week. We can't absorb that right now." "I understand that's a real cost," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't unsympathetic to the position they were in, only unmoved by the idea that their timeline obligated me to give up recorded property. But the cost of building on someone else's land doesn't go away, because fixing it is inconvenient. It just gets bigger the longer you wait to fix it. "You could sign something," Colin offered, in the tone of a man reaching for a solution rather than conceding a point. "Like a license agreement, or whatever it's called. Let us keep it there for a few years. We pay you something for it. Everybody's happy." "I'm not interested in leasing you 14 inches of my property," I said. "I'm interested in the deck being on your property. Those aren't the same offer, even though I understand why the second one sounds easier to you. I want that good neighbor line and Kristen's parking garage line, both preserved for the record, because they're the kind of thing people say right before they lose 14 inches. A permit, a contractor's fee, and a decent chunk of their opening week goodwill. I didn't say any of that to Colin in the moment. I just thanked them both for their time, walked home, and got out my binder again. I didn't call the police, because there was nothing criminal happening. This was a civil property matter, and Marion PD would have told me, correctly and probably a little wearily, to pursue it through code enforcement and the courts. I also didn't hire a lawyer for a 14-inch encroachment, because attorney's fees for a boundary dispute like this can run $8,000 to $15,000 before you've filed a single document. And there was a faster, cheaper, more effective path sitting right in front of me. One I'd used successfully once before, in 1997, when a different neighbor's driveway crept 8 inches onto my side lawn, the city's building department. I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I've done for every dispute I've ever won, and made a list. What I had: a stamped 1994 survey, dated photographs of the support posts straddling the pins, a certified letter with a signed return receipt, and, critically, no permit on file anywhere for the deck construction, which I confirmed with a quick call to the building department's public records line before I filed anything. What I didn't have: any interest in spending my retirement savings on a lawyer over 14 inches of dirt, however much that dirt mattered to me on principle. On July 3rd, I filed a formal building permit violation complaint with the City of Marion Building and Zoning Department, attaching the 1994 survey, dated photographs of the encroaching support posts and roof overhang taken from 3 angles with a tape measure visible in frame, and copies of my certified letter and the signed return receipt. I specifically flagged that no building permit had been pulled for the deck or roof structure at all, which, permitted or not, positioned on the property line or not, is its own separate violation in Marion, where any structure over 200 square feet or attached to a commercial building requires a permit before the first post goes in the ground. The complaint itself took most of a morning to file properly, and I want to walk through it, because I think people picture filing a complaint as something closer to sending an angry email than what it actually is. There's a specific form, Marion calls it a zoning and building complaint affidavit, that requires the complainant's name and address, the address of the property in violation, a written description of the violation in the complainant's own words, and a signature affirming the information is true under penalty of perjury for filing a false report. I filled it out at my kitchen table, typed rather than handwritten, because I've learned that typed complaints get taken more seriously by whoever processes the intake queue, and I attached a numbered exhibit list, Exhibit A through Exhibit F, the same way I used to format documentation for a client site back when I was still working. Exhibit A was the 1994 survey. Exhibit B and C were the dated photographs, printed in color rather than emailed, because Reina Ibarra told me later that printed photographs move through the file review process faster than digital attachments that have to be opened one at a time on an old office computer. Exhibit D was the certified letter. Exhibit E was the green return receipt card. Exhibit F was a hand-drawn site sketch showing the deck's footprint relative to the recorded property line, to scale, because I still had my old architect's scale ruler in a drawer and saw no reason not to use it. I drove the packet to the Building and Zoning Department in person rather than mailing it, mostly because I wanted a stamped copy for my own file showing the exact date and time it had been received, and because I've found that a face at the counter tends to get a complaint routed slightly faster than an envelope in a Dropbox, whatever the department's official policy says about treating both the same. The clerk at the counter, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, stamped my copy, logged the complaint under case number ZC-1147, and told me I'd hear something soon, which I already understood, from decades of dealing with municipal offices, to mean absolutely nothing in terms of an actual date. Here's the micro setback. The city's code enforcement office was backed up. My contact there, a patient civil servant named Reina Ibarra, told me it could take up to 3 weeks just to get an inspector scheduled, because Marion's small zoning department was down 2 staff positions that summer, and juggling a summer's worth of complaints about everything from unpermitted pole barns out on the county line to an illegal chicken coop 2 streets over that had apparently generated more noise complaints than I would have guessed possible from 6 hens. I wish I could tell you Tuesday, Reina told me over the phone, sounding genuinely apologetic. But I've got 11 open files ahead of yours, and 1 inspector covering the whole east side of town this month. I'd hoped for a faster turnaround. I didn't get one, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this sometimes make it sound easier than it is to simply wait 3.5 weeks while a bar continues finishing construction on your property. It was frustrating. Twice during that stretch I called Reina just to check the file hadn't been lost in the shuffle, and both times she was patient with me in a way that told me she fielded that exact call from a dozen other frustrated residents every week. "I promise you're in the queue," she told me the second time. "I know it doesn't feel like it when you're the one waiting." I used the wait productively anyway. I had Redline Surveying, Frank Osei's successor firm, come out and do a fresh boundary confirmation, which cost me $625 and gave me an unimpeachable, current, professionally stamped document instead of relying solely on one that was 30 years old, however accurate it had turned out to be. The surveyor, a young woman named Priya Basu, who'd clearly done this 100 times, set her equipment up in my side yard on a Saturday morning, a total station on a tripod, a reflector prism she had me hold at arm's length while she sighted it from 3 different positions, and a laptop that spat out coordinates instead of the tape measure and string method Frank Ose had used back in 1994. She walked me through what she was doing as she went, which I appreciated, since most surveyors treat their methodology like a trade secret. "I'm shooting off the same section corner monument your original survey references," she explained, pointing to a brass cap sunk in the sidewalk half a block away that I'd walked past 1,000 times without ever registering what it was. "Everything ties back to that. If your 1994 survey and my numbers both tie back to the same monument and land in the same place, that's about as bulletproof as boundary evidence gets for a residential property." She had her results to me by the following Wednesday. 14 inches, confirmed independently. Margin of error under half an inch. I paid her invoice the same day it arrived, because I've found professionals remember the clients who pay promptly, and I suspected I might need redline again before this was over. An inspector, a methodical young man named Curtis Doyle, finally came out on July 24th, 31 days after I filed. He walked the property line with his own equipment, cross-referenced it against both the 1994 survey and the new redline survey, took his own set of photographs, and confirmed in writing what I already knew. The deck's support posts sat 14 inches onto my property. The roof overhang extended 22 inches into the airspace above my property line, and no permit had ever been issued for either structure. He was polite about it, almost apologetic on the city's behalf for the delay, and told me before he left that he'd seen worse encroachments get away, with far less consequence, simply because nobody filed the paperwork properly. "You did the hard part already," he said. "Most people just complain. You built a file." The city issued a stop work order and a notice of violation on July 26th, giving the anchor room's operator 60 days to either remove the encroaching structure or bring it into compliance, along with a $1,200 fine for unpermitted construction. Reina Ibarra called me personally to let me know the notice had gone out, which wasn't strictly part of her job, but she told me she liked seeing a complaint file come together as cleanly as mine had. "Half the ones that cross my desk have no documentation at all," she said. "People call in angry and expect us to just know they're right. You made it easy to be right." Colin tried to fight it. He hired a local contractor to argue at the compliance hearing that the encroachment was immaterial, and that tearing out finished decking 3 weeks after opening would be an undue hardship, given how much money he'd already sunk into it. I sat through that hearing in a folding chair in the back of a municipal conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee, my binder in my lap, and I'll admit, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him even then. He wasn't a cruel man, just a stubborn one in a hurry. The hearing officer, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Hall, who had clearly sat through this exact argument from other people more than once, was unmoved. She flipped through the timeline I'd submitted: survey, letter, receipt, photographs, inspector's report, without much visible reaction until she got to the certified mail date. "Hardship doesn't attach to a structure built after you were formally notified of the boundary dispute," she said, reading from my certified letter timeline, tapping the page with one finger. "Mr. Ashford was notified on June 20th and continued construction through at least July 1st, by his own contractor's invoice dates. That's not hardship, Mr. Ashford. That's a choice, and it's one you made with full information." The anchor room was ordered to remove the encroaching posts and roof section within 30 days, obtain a proper permit for a corrected deck footprint that stayed on their own property, and pay the $1,200 fine plus $625 in reimbursement to me for the redline survey that the hearing officer accepted as the controlling evidence over the contractor's informal fence post estimate. Colin also had to post a public notice of the violation correction on the property. Per Marion's code enforcement procedure, for repeat commercial construction violations, which meant a laminated orange notice sat taped to his own front window for 2 weeks in August, right when his grand opening foot traffic was supposed to be at its peak, a detail I noticed every time I walked past with my mail. The correction work happened over 4 days in mid-August. A different, licensed contractor, a heavy-set, cheerful man named Boyd Sikora, who ran a small crew out of the next county over, and who, I later found out, had specifically been recommended to Colin by the hearing officer's own staff as someone who did this kind of correction work right the first time, pulled up the encroaching posts, cut the deck frame back to the actual property line, and reworked the roof overhang so it stopped a full 6 inches short of my side, just to be safe. Boyd came by my porch on the first morning, introduced himself, and asked if he could walk the corrected line with me before his crew touched anything, which struck me as exactly the kind of professional courtesy that had been missing from this whole process since June. "I like to have the neighbor confirm it before I cut anything," he told me, tape measure already in hand. Cheaper than cutting it twice. I walked it with him. We agreed on the marks, and he was gone within 4 days, exactly as promised, with a final invoice that itemized every hour and every board foot of lumber down to the penny, a level of transparency I noted, with some satisfaction, that Colin's first contractor had never once offered. I watched some of it from my porch with a glass of iced tea, which I'll admit was not strictly necessary, but felt earned. He apologized to me in the parking lot afterward, sort of, catching me on my way back from the mailbox. "I probably should have just moved the posts back in June," he said, hands in his pockets, looking more tired than defiant now. "Probably," I agreed. "Would have saved me about $4,000 all told, between the fine and the survey, and paying 2 contractors instead of 1. "That's usually how it works," I said, and left it there, because I try not to gloat, even when gloating is available to me. I felt, I'll admit, a small satisfaction, not vindictive, just the quiet kind that comes from being right and having the paperwork to prove it. The kind of satisfaction that doesn't need an audience, which is good, because for a few weeks that summer, I thought that was the end of the story. Here's the thing about filing a formal complaint with a city building department. It generates a paper trail, and paper trails have a way of leading places you didn't expect, if you're the sort of person who keeps reading past the part where your own problem gets solved. In early September, while reviewing the property file at the county recorder's office to confirm the corrected permit had been filed properly and the compliance was noted in the record, a habit of mine, closing the loop completely rather than just trusting a verbal assurance, I noticed something odd in the ownership record for 214 Larkspur. Colin Ashford wasn't the owner. That much I'd known from the start. He was a tenant, paying rent to whoever held the deed, but the LLC listed as the property owner, Kestrel Fenwick Holdings LLC, caught my eye because the name echoed the neighborhood's own historic name, which struck me as either a coincidence or a very deliberate piece of branding by someone who knew exactly what street they were buying into. I pulled the thread a little further, mostly out of professional curiosity at that point, and found that Kestrel Fenwick Holdings had also purchased 3 other buildings on my block in the past 18 months, all through the same registered agent in Columbus, all closing quietly, all without so much as a for sale sign going up beforehand that I could recall noticing. I mentioned it to a neighbor down the block, a retired postal carrier named Ted Marchetti, who'd lived on Larkspur even longer than I had, mostly just thinking out loud over the fence one evening while he was watering a row of tomato plants that had, by late summer, gotten thoroughly out of hand. Marchetti whistled low when I told him the name Kestrel Fenwick Holdings. "Funny," he said. "My daughter does title work over in Columbus. She mentioned a firm buying up small-town blocks like that a while back. Said it's a whole strategy some of these investment groups run now. Buy quiet, buy cheap, wait for the block to look inevitable, then ask the city to rezone it before anybody organizes." "Inevitable how?" I asked. "However they need it to look," Marchetti said, setting down his hose. "Get enough of a street under one ownership structure, even if it's spread across 4 shell names so nobody notices right away. And by the time you go to city council asking for a zoning change, you can stand up there and say, Look how much of this block is already vacant or underutilized. Wouldn't it be better used as something bigger? Never mind that they're the ones who let it sit vacant in the first place, or bought it specifically because it already was. He shook his head. My daughter says it's not even illegal, most of it, just quiet. I thanked him and told him I'd keep that in mind, not yet knowing how useful that exact piece of second-hand information would turn out to be a few months later, or how much I'd come to rely on Marchetti's daughter's second-hand gossip as an early warning system for a scheme that was, at that point, still mostly invisible to me. I hadn't been fighting a bar owner over 14 inches of dirt. I'd been fighting, without realizing it, the opening move of something much bigger, and Colin, difficult as he'd been, was probably the smallest piece on the board. I've spent enough of my career combing through county recorder archives that I know how to read a chain of title the way other people read a novel, and this one had a plot, once I sat with it long enough to see the shape of it. I spent the better part of a rainy Saturday in early September at the recorder's office, which is not most people's idea of a good weekend, but I've always found something calming about a well-organized archive. I pulled the deed records for every parcel on my block of Larkspur Street, going back 3 years, and laid the printouts across my dining room table like a jigsaw puzzle. Over the 18 months prior, Kestrel Fenwick Holdings LLC had acquired 4 properties. The building now housing the Anchor Room, the shuttered 5 and Dime 2 doors down that had sat empty since I could remember. A vacant lot that used to be a filling station before the underground tanks were decommissioned in the 2000s. And, this stopped me cold, my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. The old Fenwick Feed and Seed building directly across the street, a structure on the National Register of Historic Places that anchors the entire commercial stretch of the district, and that, as far as I knew, had been in the same family's hands since the 1950s. Each purchase had gone through a slightly different shell entity nested under the same parent. Kestrel Fenwick Holdings, Larkspur Corner Partners, 9th Street Redevelopment Group, all registered to the same Columbus Law Office, all filed by the same registered agent, a man named Warren Aldis, whose name appeared, dutifully, on every single document. I recognized the pattern immediately, because I'd seen it before in my professional life, usually from the other side of the negotiating table. A corporate landlord quietly assembling a contiguous block of parcels under separate names, so no single purchase would draw attention from anyone tracking development activity in a historic district. Then, combining the parcels later, once enough of the block was controlled, to make redevelopment financially worthwhile. It's a legal strategy. It's also, I've always thought, a slightly cowardly one, designed specifically so neighbors don't connect the dots until it's too late to organize. I called the Ohio Secretary of State's business filings database that afternoon and confirmed what I suspected. Kestrel Fenwick Holdings LLC was the parent entity behind all 4 purchases, registered to a corporate address in Columbus, with a managing member listed as a company called Brightline Urban Partners, a real estate investment firm I recognized immediately from a controversial mixed-use redevelopment they'd pushed through in Dayton 2 years earlier, one I'd actually followed at the time through the Ohio Preservation Community's newsletter, because it had demolished 3 contributing structures in a historic district there after successfully lobbying to have the district's boundaries redrawn to exclude those specific parcels. I remembered thinking, reading about it back then, that it was a shame nobody in Dayton had caught it early enough to stop it. Colin Ashford's bar wasn't really the story, and it never had been. Colin was a tenant paying rent to a landlord who was buying up my entire block, one shell company at a time, and a 14-inch deck encroachment was the first crack in a plan that had been moving quietly for a year and a half before I ever noticed a lumber truck in the alley behind his building. I didn't know yet what Brightline wanted to build on Larkspur Street. I didn't know yet how far along their plan was, or how much money was already committed to it. But I knew enough, sitting at my dining room table with deed printouts spread out like a losing hand of solitaire, to start paying very close attention to whatever Kestrel Fenwick Holdings did next. And it didn't take long for the next thing to arrive. By September, Kestrel Fenwick Holdings had started renovation work on 2 of its other Larkspur Street properties, the old 5 and Dime and the vacant filling station lot, under a general contractor working for Brightline directly, rather than a local tenant managing their own build-out. The work crews were efficient, professional, and clearly well-funded. A different tier of operation entirely from Colin's scrappy summer bar build-out. Matching polo shirts, a project trailer parked in the lot, a schedule board zip-tied to the chain-link fence. They repaved the alley behind both buildings, regraded the lots for what I assumed, correctly as it turned out, would eventually become parking, and installed new drainage infrastructure to handle it. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for what follows. I have no problem with development, and I had no problem with Kestrel Fenwick Holdings renovating buildings it legally owned. 34 years in preservation work taught me that the goal was never to freeze a neighborhood in amber. It was to make sure change happened thoughtfully, with respect for what was already there. A repaved alley and a regraded lot are not, by themselves, offenses against anything. My problem started on September 19th, 3 days after a hard evening rainstorm rolled through Marion and dumped nearly 2 inches of rain in 6 hours. When I went down into my basement to check on a box of old family photographs I keep on a shelf near the water heater. Wedding photographs, Richard's Navy portrait, our son's kindergarten drawings, the kind of things you only think to check on when something feels off, and found 2 inches of standing water pooling against my foundation wall. It had soaked through the bottom of the cardboard box before I got to it. I lost 11 photographs that night, including one of the only pictures I have of Richard holding our son the week he was born. That's the first flooding the Whitcomb house had experienced in the 31 years I'd owned it. And it's the detail that made this arc personal, in a way the deck dispute never quite was. I called a plumber first, thinking it might be a failed sump pump, since I don't have one, and had honestly been meaning to install one for years. It wasn't a sump pump problem, because there was no sump pump to fail. The plumber, a straightforward man named Gus Tallarico who'd worked on my house before. He'd redone my kitchen plumbing back in 2011, and knew the place about as well as anyone outside my family. Took one look at the water intrusion pattern along the east foundation wall, the wall closest to 214 Larkspur, and the newly regraded alley, and crouched down to run his hand along the damp mortar joints. "Eleanor, this isn't rising groundwater, and it isn't a cracked pipe," he said. "This is coming from outside, and it's coming from a direction. Something's pushing water at your foundation that wasn't doing that before, and it wasn't doing it before because it had somewhere else to go." That sent me back to my archives, because that's where I keep answers, and because I happen to already know exactly where to look. Marion's original 1962 stormwater infrastructure plans, which I'd pulled years earlier during a research project on the historic district's utility easements, one of those projects that felt purely academic at the time, showed a drainage swale running along the alley behind Larkspur Street that had been engineered specifically to carry runoff away from the corner lots, including mine, toward a storm drain at the 9th Street intersection. That swale had existed, undisturbed and doing its quiet job, for 60 years, long enough that nobody currently living on the block had ever thought about it, myself included, until it stopped working. When Kestrel Fenwick Holdings contractor regraded the alley and repaved it in August, in the course of what I'm sure their civil engineer considered a perfectly reasonable parking lot improvement, they'd filled in and flattened that drainage swale to create a level parking surface behind the renovated buildings. Without the swale doing its job, rainwater that used to flow safely to the 9th Street storm drain was now pooling in the newly level alley and running downhill directly toward my foundation instead, following gravity exactly the way gravity has always worked, just toward a different house than it used to. I contacted the contractor's site supervisor first, a reasonable-seeming man named Phil DeShane, who came by within a day of my call, looked at the flooding with what seemed like genuine concern, and told me he'd simply followed the grading plan his engineering firm had provided, and wasn't aware of any historic drainage feature running through that alley. Nobody had flagged it, not in the geotechnical survey, not in the permit application, nowhere. That, I believed. Phil wasn't my villain, and I told him so directly, because I've found it's worth separating the people executing a plan from the people who designed it. But when I asked Phil to connect me with someone at Brightline Urban Partners directly, since Kestrel Fenwick Holdings was, after all, the property owner responsible for the damage regardless of whose crew did the digging, I was routed to a regional development manager named Craig Merchant, And Craig was a different story entirely. The kind of man who answers a phone call about your flooded basement in the same brisk, unbothered tone he'd probably use to discuss lunch reservations. We had our own civil engineer review that alley before we broke ground, Craig told me over the phone, in the flat tone of a man reading from a talking points memo he'd used before and would clearly use again. There's no easement on file for a drainage swale in that location. If the county doesn't have it recorded, we're not obligated to accommodate it. I have the 1962 municipal engineering plans showing it, I said. I can send them to you today. Municipal plans aren't a recorded easement, Ms. Voss, Craig said, and I could hear, even over the phone, the particular confidence of a man who believes the paperwork is entirely on his side. I understand you're upset about the water, and I sympathize, but that's really more of a maintenance issue on your end. Older foundations settle. Older basements take on water sometimes. It happens independent of anything we've done. It's happened exactly once in 31 years, I said. 3 days after your crew regraded the alley behind my house. I hear you, Craig seen, in the specific tone people use when they very much do not intend to act on what they've just heard. Can I ask who your civil engineer was, so I can send them the 1962 plans directly? I asked, mostly to see if he'd actually answer. That's not really how this works, Craig said. Our engineering review is proprietary to the project. I'd suggest again that you talk to your own insurance carrier. My insurance carrier isn't going to cover damage caused by your regrading work, I said. That's not a mystery, Mr. Merchant. That's just how homeowners' policies are written. You'd know that if you'd ever filed one. There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable, before Craig recovered his talking points cadence. I appreciate your perspective, Miss Voss. I'll make a note of the conversation. I sent Craig Merchant and Kestrel Fenwick Holdings LLC directly a certified letter on September 26th, the same approach that had worked with Colin, because a paper trail is a paper trail regardless of the size of the entity you're dealing with, and because I've learned that companies, like people, tend to behave better once they know their responses are being kept in writing. I enclosed the 1962 municipal drainage plans, dated photographs of the flooding, Gus Tallarico's written assessment of the foundation damage, and a request that they restore adequate drainage capacity along the alley and cover the cost of my foundation repairs, which Gus had estimated at roughly $9,000 for waterproofing and grading correction, based on the damage visible after the first flood alone. Craig's response, dated October 3rd, arrived not from Craig himself, but from a company attorney, 2 clipped sentences declining any responsibility, and suggesting that if I had concerns about pre-existing foundation conditions, I should consult my own engineer and my own insurance carrier. There was no acknowledgement of the 1962 plans at all, as though I hadn't sent them. It rained again on October 9th, a slower, steadier storm that lasted most of a day, rather than a single violent evening, which somehow made it worse. Hours of water finding every path of least resistance, instead of one hard rush. The basement flooded worse this time, nearly 4 inches standing against the east wall, enough to ruin a section of subfloor above it, and start visible cracking along the foundation's mortar joints. Hairline fractures spreading out from the corner nearest the alley like a spiderweb. I stood down there in rain boots at 11 at night with a flashlight, watching water seep steadily through a joint that had been dry and solid for 3 decades. And I remember thinking, quite calmly, that this was no longer a nuisance. This was structural. I documented everything, the way I document everything. Photographs from multiple angles, a moisture meter reading log I kept for the following 2 weeks to track how slowly the walls dried out, and a second written assessment from Gus, confirming the damage had worsened measurably between the 2 storms, with specific measurements comparing the crack widths from September to October. Gus brought a set of feeler gauges on his second visit, the kind machinists used to measure the gap between metal parts, and had me hold a flashlight while he measured each crack to the 16th of an inch, calling out numbers for me to write down. September 23rd, hairline, barely a 16th, he read off. October 11th, 3/16ths in the same spot. That's not settling, Eleanor. Settling doesn't move that fast in 3 weeks. That's active water pressure finding a weak point and working it wider every time it rains. He wrote his findings up formally that evening and emailed them to me before he'd even finished his second cup of coffee at his own kitchen table, because Gus, whatever his faults, has never once been slow about paperwork when it mattered to a client he liked. I called Craig Merchant one more time, mostly so I could say, later, that I had given him every reasonable chance before escalating further. "You're on notice that your regrading work is actively causing structural damage to my home," I told him, reading almost verbatim from notes I'd written beforehand, so I wouldn't leave anything out. "I have 2 independent flooding events, professional damage assessments for both, and the original municipal engineering plans showing exactly why this is happening. I'd strongly encourage you to fix the drainage before this gets considerably more expensive for everyone involved." Craig's response has stuck with me ever since, in the way certain sentences do, because they reveal exactly how someone sees the situation. "Ms. Voss, with respect, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar redevelopment project here. We're not going to re-engineer an alley over one homeowner's water in her basement." That sentence told me 2 things, and I sat with the phone still in my hand for a moment after he hung up, turning them both over. First, that Craig had no intention of doing the right thing voluntarily, and probably never had. Second, and this was the more interesting part, the part that made me set down my coffee and go get a fresh legal pad, that there was, in fact, a multi-million-dollar redevelopment project underway, which was the first time anyone at the company had confirmed, out loud and on the record, that this was about far more than 4 scattered, seemingly unrelated building purchases. Craig had meant it as a dismissal. I heard it as a confession. A civil dispute over drainage damage between a homeowner and a corporate LLC is exactly the kind of case where hiring a lawyer immediately and suing feels satisfying, but is usually a mistake. Litigation like that can take 12 to 18 months and $15,000 to $25,000 in legal fees before you see a dime, with no guarantee of winning outright even with good facts on your side, since corporate defendants can afford to drag things out until an individual homeowner runs out of patience or money first. I needed something faster and more targeted. Something that would put pressure exactly where a company like Brightline would feel it. I went back to the Marion City Engineer's office and requested the complete original 1962 stormwater plans, certified copies, along with any subsequent utility easement documentation for the alley behind Larkspur Street. The city engineer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Priya Nandakumar, who reminded me a little of myself 30 years earlier, pulled up the file on her computer, frowned at it for a long moment, then turned the monitor so I could see it too. "This is better than you think," she said, which is not a sentence I hear often enough in these situations to not remember exactly how she said it. The drainage swale wasn't just shown on old engineering plans. It had actually been formalized as a recorded drainage easement in 1971, filed with the county recorder as part of a utility corridor agreement between the city and the property owners at the time, a document that predated even my ownership of the Whitcomb house by more than 2 decades. It had simply been forgotten, buried in archives on outdated parcel numbers, because nothing had disturbed it in 50-plus years of quiet, uneventful function until Kestrel Fenwick Holdings paved over it in a single August work order. "Here's what I don't understand," I said, watching her scroll through the file. "How does a licensed civil engineer miss a recorded drainage easement during a due diligence review? Isn't that exactly the kind of thing a title search or a utility survey is supposed to catch?" Dr. Nanda Kumar leaned back in her chair, the particular weary look of someone who'd seen this exact failure mode more than once in her career. "It should catch it, if the search is done properly and the indexing is current. But this easement is filed under the pre-1990 parcel numbering scheme, cross-referenced to a utility corridor agreement, rather than filed as a standalone easement on the 2 affected deeds directly. A rush title search, the kind a developer's council runs when they're trying to close 4 acquisitions quickly and quietly, could absolutely miss it if the searcher wasn't specifically looking for utility corridor agreements from that era. It's sloppy, but it's not rare. I see it more than you'd think." She tapped the screen. "Doesn't make it any less enforceable, though. Recorded is recorded, whether or not somebody's engineer bothered to find it." That changed everything, and I felt something in my chest unclench slightly, for the first time since the second flood. This wasn't a vague historical claim anymore, easily dismissed the way Craig had dismissed the 1962 plans. It was a recorded legal easement, filed, indexed, enforceable, that Kestrel Fenwick Holdings had violated by regrading over it without accounting for its function, causing quantifiable, documented, increasingly expensive property damage to my home. Here's my micro setback. Getting the county recorder's office to actually locate and certify a copy of the 1971 easement filing took far longer than expected, because the deed had been indexed under an old parcel numbering system that predated Marion's digital records conversion in the 1990s, and the physical document itself had been moved at some point to an off-site storage annex that even the recorder's own staff seemed a little vague on the details of. Dr. Nandakumar and I spent the better part of 3 weeks working with the county recorder's archivist, a patient, unhurried man named Otto Hutton, who took obvious pride in his filing system, despite how confusing it was to everyone outside it, manually cross-referencing rolls of microfiche in a windowless room that smelled like old paper and toner. Hutton's system, once he explained it, actually made a strange kind of sense. Marion had renumbered every parcel in the city in 1991 when it computerized its records, mapping old parcel numbers to new ones in a conversion table that Hutton kept, not digitally, but in a single battered 3-ring binder he referred to, without any apparent irony, as the Rosetta Stone. The 1971 easement had been filed against the old parcel number for what was then an undeveloped lot behind the Feed and Seed building, a number that had since been split, renumbered, and folded into 3 separate modern parcels as the block subdivided over the decades. Finding the original filing meant first finding which old parcel number the alley had belonged to in 1971, then tracing that number forward through 2 subsequent renumbering events to confirm it still covered the same physical ground Kestrel Fenwick had just paved over. I'd hoped for a week, I told Hutton on our second visit, not bothering to hide my frustration. He didn't take it personally, which I appreciated. Everybody hopes for a week, he said, sliding another roll of microfiche into the reader. Most of what's in this room hasn't been touched since Nixon was president. It's not going to give up its secrets in a week just because somebody needs it to. He wasn't wrong. And once I stopped being frustrated about the timeline and started treating the search the way I'd have treated any other archival research project in my old career, the work actually became almost enjoyable. The same quiet satisfaction of finding a document exactly where 40 years of bureaucratic drift said it shouldn't be. I'd hoped for a week. It took 22 days, 3 of which involved Hutton being out sick and nobody else knowing quite where to look, and 1 more lost entirely to a mislabeled microfiche roll that put us through an entire box of 1969 filings before Hutton realized the county's own labeling had transposed 2 digits decades earlier. During that time, it rained twice more. Nothing as severe as the 2 big storms, thankfully, but enough that my basement took on standing water both times regardless, a fact I made sure to document just as carefully as the first 2 floods, because a pattern is worth more than a single incident in front of anyone who eventually has to evaluate this claim. Once I had the recorded easement in hand, certified copy in my binder next to the 1962 plans, I did 2 things simultaneously. Because I've learned that pressure applied from a single direction is easy for a company to absorb, and pressure applied from 2 directions at once tends to actually move something. First, I filed a formal drainage law violation complaint with the city's engineering department, since obstructing a recorded municipal drainage easement is a code violation independent of any private dispute between me and Kestrel Fenwick Holdings, meaning the city itself now had its own regulatory interest in forcing a fix, separate from whether I ever recovered a dime for my foundation. Second, on the advice of a real estate attorney named Marcus Kendrick, whom I consulted for a flat $400 fee, just to confirm my approach was sound, not to litigate, just to get 1 qualified opinion before I filed anything binding, I filed a mechanics lien-style property lien against the Kestrel Fenwick Holdings parcel, for the cost of my foundation repair. Using Ohio's provisions allowing a property owner to file a lien against a neighboring property when that property's owner has caused direct, documented damage and failed to remedy it after written notice. Kendrick was blunt about it during our 1 consultation. This isn't a slam-dunk claim if it goes to court, because it's not the most common use of this filing. But it's legally available to you. Your documentation is unusually strong for a homeowner. And more importantly, it puts a cloud on their title that they will absolutely notice, probably faster than they'd notice a lawsuit. That last part turned out to be exactly right. It's not a common tool, but it's a legal one, and it put a cloud on Kestrel Fenwick Holdings' title for that specific parcel, meaning they couldn't refinance, sell, or leverage that property cleanly for any future financing round until the lien was resolved, which for a company in the middle of assembling a large redevelopment package is a considerably bigger problem than it sounds. The lien got their attention in a way the certified letters never had. Within 11 days of the filing being recorded with the county, Brightline's actual general counsel, not Craig Merchant, who I noticed was suddenly and permanently unavailable whenever I called his direct line, reached out to me directly. Her name was Diane Prescott, and she was, refreshingly, someone who understood exactly what a title cloud on an active development parcel meant to a company trying to assemble financing for a large project, and who clearly had no patience left for Craig's approach to the problem. "We'd like to resolve this without further escalation," Prescott said in our first call, in the careful, measured voice of someone whose engineering team had just told her, privately and probably uncomfortably, that yes, there had in fact been a recorded 1971 easement, and yes, their contractor's civil engineer should have found it during due diligence before anyone ever touched that alley. "I've reviewed your documentation. It's thorough. I don't think a court fight over this serves either of us." We went back and forth for about 2 weeks, nothing dramatic, mostly emails, and one longer phone call where Prescott asked pointed, professional questions about my damage estimates, and I answered them with the same specificity I'd used with everyone else in this story, because specificity is what makes people believe you. "Walk me through the $11,400 figure," Prescott said during that call, not accusingly, just thoroughly, the way I imagine she approached every settlement negotiation she'd ever handled. "I want to understand what's driving the number before I take a recommendation upstairs." I had it broken down and ready, because I'd learned by then that vague numbers invite argument and itemized numbers tend to end it. Gus Tallarico's original estimate for waterproofing and grading correction after the first flood was $9,000. After the second flood widened the foundation cracks and damaged a section of subfloor, his revised estimate came to $10,650. The 2 additional minor flooding events during the county records delay added another $750 in incremental moisture damage to the same subfloor section, which Gus itemized separately so it wouldn't look like padding. That's $11,400, and I can send you all 3 of his written assessments with dates, if it would help your recommendation. "It would," Prescott said. "Send them today if you can. I'd rather go upstairs with too much documentation than not enough." I had them in her inbox within the hour, and I noticed, with some satisfaction, that she thanked me for the turnaround time in her reply the next morning. A small thing, but a telling one, after months of dealing with Craig Merchant's studied indifference to anything resembling a deadline. The resolution, finalized in late November, Kestrel Fenwick Holdings paid for my full foundation repair and waterproofing, totaling $11,400 once the worsened damage from the second flood and the additional 2 minor floods during the records delay were factored in. Paid a $3,500 fine to the city for the drainage easement violation, and, at Dr. Nandakumar's insistence, written into the settlement as a condition, funded the full restoration of the drainage swale behind the block, re-engineered to modern stormwater standards, but preserving the original 1971 easement's function, exactly as designed 60 years earlier. The lien was released the same week payment cleared, and I watched a crew redig that swale in early December, with more satisfaction than I probably should admit to. Craig Merchant did not personally apologize, not once, not even in writing. Diane Prescott did, on the company's behalf, in a way that sounded like it came from actual legal exposure rather than actual remorse, which I've found is usually how corporate apologies work. And I've made my peace with that a long time ago. I don't need sincerity from a company. I need a check that clears and a swale that drains. For what it's worth, Prescott told me near the end of our final call, her voice dropping into something a little more informal than the rest of our professional exchanges had been. I flagged some concerns internally about how fast this project has been moving and about some of the entities involved in structuring it. I don't think you've seen the last of Kestrel Fenwick's interest in your street, Ms. Voss. I'd keep paying attention if I were you. I thanked her for the candor, hung up, and did exactly that. I also mentioned Prescott's warning to Ted Marchetti the next time I saw him out walking his dog, mostly to see if his daughter's Columbus title work gossip had any more specifics attached to it. Marchetti didn't have anything new for me, but he said something that stuck with me for the rest of that winter. Companies like that don't stop unless something makes stopping cheaper than continuing, he said, scratching his dog's ears. You've made 2 things expensive for them already, Eleanor. Wouldn't surprise me if there's a third. He wasn't wrong. She was right, and it didn't take long to find out how. In early December, going through Marion's public meeting agendas, something I do out of habit, a leftover reflex from 34 years in preservation work that Richard used to call my civic hobby, I found a notice for an upcoming Historic Preservation Board meeting with an item titled Discussion, Old Fenwick Historic District Boundary and Designation Review, scheduled for the board's regular January session. That kind of item doesn't appear on an agenda by accident. Boundary and designation reviews aren't routine business. I know that better than almost anyone in Marion, having sat through more of these board meetings over the decades than I can accurately count. Someone had specifically requested it be placed there, and city boards don't generate agenda items out of thin air. They respond to requests, usually from a board member, sometimes from an outside party with enough standing to ask. I downloaded the full meeting packet that same evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop, and read through nearly 60 pages of staff report, zoning analysis, and supporting documents. Buried on page 41, in a section labeled Supplemental Materials Submitted for Board Consideration, was a reference to a redevelopment feasibility study commissioned by a firm called Brightline Urban Partners, the same name Diane Prescott's company letterhead had used, the same name behind Kestrel Fenwick Holdings, now sitting in an official city document as though it belonged there. I read that page 3 times before I set the laptop down and just sat there for a while, doing the math on how far this had actually progressed. I've sat on the other side of a preservation board table more times than I can count, testifying as an expert witness, advising on design guideline compliance, occasionally arguing with a board that didn't want to listen to me, and being right about it anyway. So I know how those boards work, and I know that a boundary and designation review doesn't get scheduled unless a board chair or a majority of members specifically request it be placed on the agenda. It's not the kind of thing that comes up because somebody happened to mention it over coffee. I requested the public records for who had asked for that agenda item, filing a formal public records request under Ohio's Sunshine Law the very next morning, before I'd even finished my tea from the night before. Ohio's public records law is more useful than most people realize, and more limited than most people assume. A citizen can request nearly any record a public body maintains, but the request has to identify the record with enough specificity that the office knows what to pull, and the office can take a reasonable amount of time to respond, a word that means something different depending on how backed up the clerk's office happens to be that month. I asked specifically for any correspondence, emails, or written requests related to placing the Old Fenwick Historic District Boundary and Designation Review item on the board's agenda, plus the board chairman's meeting planning correspondence for the preceding 90 days, because I wanted a paper trail wide enough that nobody could later claim the item had simply appeared through routine staff process. It took 2 weeks for the city clerk's office to process it, longer than I'd hoped, though not unreasonably long for a small city clerk's office handling a request that touched multiple departments and required someone to search through a shared email server for the right date range. The clerk, a soft-spoken man named Herbert Youngblood, who'd processed enough of my records requests over the decades to recognize my name on site, called me the day the packet was ready, rather than simply mailing it, which I appreciated. "There's more here than I expected, Eleanor," he said, which was as close to editorializing as Herbert ever allowed himself to get on the phone. I got my answer within the packet. The request had come directly from the Preservation Board chairman, a man named Gordon Reski, in a 2-line email to city staff dated back in November, weeks before the item had ever surfaced publicly. Gordon had chaired Marion's Historic Preservation Board for 9 years. I'd known him professionally for most of that time. Not close friends, but respectful colleagues who'd sat through countless design review hearings together, argued over paint colors and window replacements, and the occasional contentious demolition request, gone out for coffee after meetings a handful of times over the years to commiserate about difficult applicants. I would not have called him corruptible if you'd asked me in November. I would have called him, at worst, a little too fond of being the most important man in the room, a little too attached to the sound of his own gavel. Finding out what I found out about him was, honestly, one of the more disappointing parts of this whole ordeal, because I genuinely respected the man for most of a decade. So I did what I do with everything else. I went looking for records, because records don't disappoint you the way people sometimes do. They just tell you the truth, whatever it turns out to be. Ohio requires financial disclosure filings for members of municipal boards with regulatory authority, updated annually, and I pulled Gordon's most recent filing from the city clerk's office. Buried in a section listing outside business interests, in a line so brief I almost skimmed past it, was a limited partnership called Larkspur Vista Partners, formed 4 months earlier. Around the same time, I noted that Kestrel Fenwick Holdings had acquired the old Fenwick Feed and Seed building across from mine. I cross-referenced the LLC filing with the Ohio Secretary of State's database that same evening. My hands, I'll admit, not quite steady on the keyboard by that point. Larkspur Vista Partners had exactly 2 members listed. One was a consulting entity registered to Gordon Reska's home address on Chestnut Street, a house I'd been inside twice for holiday parties. The other member, listed plainly on the filing as though it had nothing to hide, was Brightline Urban Partners. Gordon Resk, the man responsible for deciding whether Old Fenwick kept its historic designation, held a financial stake through a shell partnership formed months earlier, timed almost precisely with Brightline's acquisitions, in the very company that stood to profit enormously if that designation disappeared. If the district lost its protected status, Brightline could demolish the buildings it had spent 18 months quietly acquiring and put up whatever large-scale commercial development a multi-million-dollar redevelopment project implied, without design review, without height restrictions, without any of the constraints that had kept this stretch of Larkspur Street looking the way it had for over a century. And the man who would cast the deciding recommendation on whether that happened stood to personally profit from the outcome he was supposed to be evaluating impartially. There was a rezoning and de-designation vote scheduled for the following month, in mid-February. If it passed, everything I had just spent 6 months fighting for, my boundary, my foundation, the integrity of the block, Gus Talarico's careful repair work, Priya Basu's survey, Dr. Nandakumar's swale restoration, would be swept aside anyway, because the whole district would lose the protections that made any of it matter in the first place. A 14-inch encroachment and a flooded basement would become historical footnotes in a neighborhood that no longer had a historic designation to protect it. I sat with that for 1 full evening, letting myself feel something closer to real anger than I had at any other point in this story, before I picked up my legal pad again the next morning and got to work. I had 5 weeks before the vote. That's not a lot of time to stop a rezoning effort, backed by a well-funded developer, and steered by the very official responsible for overseeing it. But 5 weeks is enough time if you know exactly where to look, and you don't waste any of it being outraged instead of organized. I've always believed that the difference between people who win these fights and people who lose them isn't passion. Everyone involved has plenty of that. It's whether they spend their limited time gathering documentation or gathering sympathy. Sympathy doesn't hold up in a council chambers. Documentation does. I laid out my 5 weeks like a construction schedule, because that's the only way I know how to think about a deadline that matters. Week 1, confirm the legal mechanics of what the board could and couldn't actually do. Week 2, file the ethics complaint and put Gordon on notice in writing. Week 3 and 4, organize the neighborhood. Week 5, the hearing itself. I taped the schedule to my refrigerator, the way I used to tape project timelines to my office wall decades earlier. And I worked it exactly the way I'd have worked any restoration deadline. 1 task at a time. No shortcuts. No skipped steps. The proposal itself, once I read the full staff report line by line at my kitchen table, with a highlighter in hand, was worse than I'd expected. It wasn't a modest boundary adjustment, a tweak at the edges to accommodate some minor inconvenience. It called for removing historic district protections from the entire 6-parcel Larkspur Street commercial block, including the Fenwick Feed and Seed Building, a National Register-listed structure that had anchored that corner since 1908, and reclassifying it under Marion's general commercial zoning, which would allow buildings up to 5 stories, with no design review requirement whatsoever. Brightline's feasibility study, attached to the packet as supporting material as though it were simply a neutral planning document rather than the blueprint for its own interests, sketched out exactly what they intended: a mixed-use development, combining ground-floor retail with 60 apartment units, demolishing 3 of the 4 historic structures they'd acquired outright, and gutting the 4th, the Feed and Seed Building, down to little more than a decorative facade bolted onto a modern steel frame behind it, the kind of historic preservation that preserves nothing but a photograph-friendly wall. I'd seen renderings like that before, in other cities, always described with the same bloodless language: adaptive reuse, contextual redevelopment, honoring the character of the corridor. What it actually meant, every time, was that the building's soul got scooped out and its face got kept as decoration. I'd spent 34 years fighting exactly that outcome professionally. I wasn't about to let it happen on my own street without a fight. Gordon Resk had not disclosed his financial interest in Larkspur Vista Partners anywhere in the board's public materials. Not in the staff report, not in his own board member statement, not in the routine conflict of interest checkbox every board member is required to complete before a vote. Ohio ethics law requires municipal board members to disclose direct or indirect financial interests in matters before them, and to recuse themselves from voting on those matters, a requirement Gordon had simply ignored, presumably betting, correctly for 4 months, that no one would think to check a shell partnership's ownership structure over what looked, on its surface, like a routine-sounding zoning item buried on page 41 of a 60-page packet. I confronted him first, the way I'd confronted Colin and, by extension, Craig Merchant, giving him the chance to do the right thing before I made anything public, because that's the process I believe in, even for people who I suspect, deep down, aren't going to take the offer. I called Gordon on a Tuesday evening in early January, and I could hear his television on in the background when he picked up, the ordinary sound of a man settling into his evening, with no idea his week was about to change. "Eleanor, hello! This is a surprise," he said, and I could hear the television click off. "Gordon, I need to ask you about something, and I'd rather ask you directly than go around you." I gave him a moment, then said it plainly, the way I'd rehearsed it twice in my kitchen before dialing. I pulled the Secretary of State filing for a partnership called Larkspur Vista Partners. Your name's on it, alongside Brightline Urban Partners. You didn't disclose that anywhere in the board materials for the old Fenwick designation vote you scheduled for next month. There was a long pause, long enough that I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Gordon said, in the voice of a man who has decided, in the space of that pause, that confidence is his best remaining option. "Eleanor, that partnership is a passive real estate investment, a small one. It has nothing to do with how I evaluate preservation policy as chairman, and frankly, I'd ask you not to turn this into something it isn't." "It has everything to do with it, Gordon," I said, keeping my voice level, the way I keep my voice level with everyone in these situations, because raised voices tend to make people defensive instead of honest. You have a direct financial stake in a company that benefits enormously, millions of dollars, by their own feasibility study. If the district you oversee loses its designation, that's not a gray area. That's the exact scenario disclosure law exists to catch. "You're assuming intent that isn't there," Gordon said, his voice climbing slightly. "I've chaired that board for 9 years, Eleanor. 9 years of unpaid public service to this city, I might add. And you're going to reduce all of that to one investment you found in a database." "I'm not reducing anything," I said. "I'm asking you to disclose it publicly and recuse yourself, the way the law requires. That's all. If it's really as passive and irrelevant as you say, that costs you nothing." He didn't have an answer for that one right away, which told me more than anything he'd said up to that point. I gave him one more opportunity, in writing this time, because I wanted the record to show unmistakably that I had. On January 14th, I sent Gordon a formal letter, copied to the city's law director, the city manager's office, and, for good measure, the two vice chairs of the Preservation Board, asking him to publicly disclose the conflict, recuse himself from the vote, and postpone the hearing until an unconflicted board could review the matter fresh, without a chairman whose household finances depended on the outcome. His response, received January 21st, was a 2-paragraph letter, not from Gordon at all, but from a Columbus attorney I didn't recognize. Not notably, the city's own counsel, but private counsel, retained personally, which told me a great deal about who Gordon believed he needed protection from, and how seriously he was taking the situation, despite his confident tone on the phone. The letter asserted that his investment in Larkspur Vista Partners was immaterial to his Preservation Board duties, that the partnership predated any specific knowledge of the pending zoning matter, a claim the timeline made difficult to believe, given the partnership had formed within weeks of Kestrel Fenwick's first Larkspur Street acquisition, and that he intended to proceed with chairing the scheduled hearing as planned, with no recusal and no public disclosure. Immaterial, that word again. Colin had used a version of it about 14 inches of dirt that turned out to matter quite a bit. Craig Merchant had used a version of it about a foundation with 4 inches of standing water sitting in it. Now Gordon's attorney was using it about a financial stake in the very outcome Gordon was supposed to be deciding without bias. I was starting to notice a pattern among people who stood to lose something the moment they admitted otherwise. And I'll admit that by the third time I heard that word, it had stopped sounding like an argument and started sounding like a confession dressed up in a law degree. Exposing a conflict of interest to a lawyer or a newspaper is one path, and plenty of people would have stopped there. I chose a more direct one, because I know how public hearings work, and I know that a room full of engaged, informed residents is one of the most effective tools available in local government. More effective, often, than a lawsuit, and available to anyone willing to do the unglamorous organizing work that most people skip. First, the paper trail, because everything in this story had started with paper and I saw no reason to change strategies now that the stakes were highest. I compiled everything. The Secretary of State filing for Larkspur Vista Partners, Gordon's financial disclosure omission from the current year's filing, the precise timeline connecting the partnership's formation to Kestrel Fenwick Holdings acquisitions, and the staff report showing Brightline's redevelopment feasibility study, attached as though it were neutral background material. I filed a formal ethics complaint with the Ohio Ethics Commission on January 24th, not because I expected a fast resolution, since state ethics investigations typically take months and sometimes longer, but because filing it created an official record that existed independently of anything that happened at the local hearing, dated and time-stamped, and because Gordon's private attorney needed to know that record existed on file with the state before the vote, whether or not it resolved before then. Second, the deed records, and this was the piece that mattered most, the kind of detail that only someone who spent 3 decades in preservation work would think to go looking for, tucked away in a filing most people assume is just bureaucratic boilerplate. When Old Fenwick was designated a historic district in 1978, the original designation ordinance had been recorded not just as a zoning overlay, the kind that a board or council can adjust with relative ease, but with an accompanying preservation covenant, attached directly to the deeds of the 6 original commercial parcels on Larkspur Street, a covenant requiring a 2/3 supermajority vote of the full city council, not a simple preservation board recommendation, to remove designation from any parcel carrying that specific covenant language. I found this in the original 1978 recording, sitting in a folder at the county recorder's office that I'd actually helped research decades earlier, during a graduate assistantship in preservation law, back when Old Fenwick's designation was brand new, and I was 26 years old, and had no earthly idea I'd spend the back half of my life living inside the district I was helping document. Finding that folder again, all these years later, felt like something closer to fate than coincidence, though I try not to lean on that kind of language too heavily. What that covenant meant, in practical terms, was enormous. The Preservation Board had no authority to approve de-designation on its own, regardless of how the vote went in that chambers. At most, it could recommend the change to City Council, and any recommendation would then require 9 of 13 council votes to pass, not the simple majority Brightline's plan seemed to be quietly counting on, based on how the staff report was worded. Gordon's entire process, however it played out that night, was procedurally incomplete before it even started, and I intended to make sure everyone in that room knew it. Third, the community, which took the most time and the most shoe leather of anything in this whole ordeal. I spent 2 weeks going door to door on Larkspur and the surrounding blocks, 9th Street, Chestnut, the 2 side streets that fed into the district, not asking anyone to trust me blindly on my word alone, but sitting at kitchen tables and front porches, showing people the actual documents, the ethics filing, the Secretary of State printout with Gordon's and Brightline's names side by side, the 1978 deed covenant, the redevelopment feasibility study with its demolition renderings. Believability works both ways, and I've always believed the same standard I hold others to should apply to me. So I brought paper, not outrage, to every single conversation. Some neighbors were furious the moment they understood what they were looking at. Others needed to read it twice before it sank in. Faye Corcoran at the flower shop read the Secretary of State filing, standing behind her own counter, went quiet for a long moment, and then said, "I bought Gordon's wife's Christmas wreaths for 12 years. 12 years, Eleanor." I didn't have anything to say to that, except that I understood exactly how she felt, because I'd felt some version of it myself the week I found the filing. By the end of the 2 weeks, I had commitments from over 60 households to attend the hearing, a shared folder of documents that half the block had read before the meeting even started, and a rotating list of 6 residents willing to speak during public comment alongside me, so the room wouldn't hear this story from just one voice and dismiss it as one disgruntled homeowner's grievance. Here's my micro setback, and it arrived at the worst possible moment, the way these things always seem to. 2 days before the hearing, Gordon's attorney sent a letter to the city law director arguing that the 1978 covenant was administratively superseded by a 1996 zoning code recodification and no longer legally binding, a claim clearly designed to neutralize my strongest piece of evidence right before the public ever got a chance to hear it, filed quietly enough that I only found out about it because Dr. Nandakumar's office called to give me a courtesy heads up. I'm not ashamed to say it rattled me for about an hour. I'd built my entire closing argument around that covenant, and if Gordon's attorney was right, the whole supermajority requirement I'd been counting on might not exist anymore, which would leave the board's simple majority vote standing unchallenged on procedural grounds, even if the ethics complaint eventually went somewhere. I spent a frantic 36 hours chasing down the answer. I called Dr. Nandakumar's office first, then a land use attorney named Renata Cho, whom I hired for this one specific question at a cost of $1,800. Money I didn't love spending 2 days before a hearing, but money I considered essential at that point. Renata and I worked through the 1996 recodification ordinance page by page, late into the evening, both of us running on coffee, and the particular grim focus that comes from a deadline that can't move. We finally found it close to 3 in the morning, the night before the hearing. Section 14.3 of the 1996 recodification ordinance. 4 sentences buried in a transitional provisions appendix that nobody without a very specific reason to look would ever read, explicitly stating that all covenants and restrictions recorded prior to the recodification's effective date remained in full force and were not altered by the code's reorganization. Renata read it aloud to me over the phone twice, just to be sure neither of us was imagining it out of exhaustion, and then we both just sat with the relief of it for a moment before getting back to work preparing exhibits for the next evening. Gordon's attorney had been betting that nobody would go looking that hard, that fast, over a 4-sentence appendix in a decades-old recodification ordinance. He'd bet against exactly the wrong person. The hearing, held February 18th in Marion's council chambers, drew the largest public turnout for a preservation matter I'd seen in a decade. Nearly 90 residents, many holding printed copies of the documents I'd shared over the previous 2 weeks, more than the room's official capacity of 70. with an overflow group listening from the hallway through the propped open double doors. I recognized nearly every face. Faye Corcoran from the flower shop. Gus Tallarico, still in his work coveralls, having come straight from a job. A retired schoolteacher named Marjorie Yun, who'd taught half the block's children at one point or another. It was, I'll admit, a genuinely moving thing to see. However calmly I tried to hold myself through the evening. Gordon opened the meeting, attempting to gavel through the agenda, as if nothing unusual was happening, running through routine business first, a sign variance for a coffee shop, a minor setback exception for a garage, with the studied normalcy of a man hoping the room's energy might simply dissipate before it reached the item that mattered. It didn't. If anything, the weight made the room more focused, not less. I was the third resident to speak during public comment on the old Fenwick item, walking up to the podium with my binder, the same binder, more or less, that had started this whole thing back in June, and a printed handout I'd prepared for the council and the record. I kept it simple, because I've found that calm, well-documented facts read aloud in a packed room do more damage to a bad argument than any amount of shouting ever could, and because shouting was never who I wanted to be in front of my own neighbors. My name is Eleanor Voss. I live at 210 Larkspur, and I've served this city's preservation efforts, in one professional capacity or another, for over 3 decades. I began. I want to walk you through 3 documents tonight, and then I'll sit down. I held up the first page. This is a Secretary of State filing for a partnership called Larkspur Vista Partners, formed in September of last year. It lists 2 members, a consulting entity registered to Preservation Board Chairman Gordon Reski's home address, and Brightline Urban Partners, the same company whose redevelopment feasibility study is attached as supporting material to tonight's staff report. I let that sit in the room for a moment before continuing. I could hear the murmur start behind me, but I didn't turn around. Mr. Reski has a direct financial interest, through that partnership, in the company that stands to profit substantially if this district loses its historic designation, I went on. He did not disclose that interest anywhere in the board's materials, as required under Ohio ethics law for exactly this kind of situation. I filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Ethics Commission on January 24th. That complaint is now a matter of public record, and I have copies here for anyone who'd like one. I held up the second document. This is the 1978 designation ordinance for the Old Fenwick Historic District, which includes a preservation covenant recorded directly on the deeds of the 6 parcels under discussion tonight. That covenant requires a 2/3 supermajority vote of the full city council, 9 of 13 votes, to remove designation from any parcel it covers. It is not something this board can recommend forward on a simple majority, and it never has been. Third document. And this is section 14.3 of the 1996 zoning recodification, which explicitly preserves that covenant's validity, in case anyone was told otherwise this week. Tonight's process is invalid twice over, I finished, before we even get to the question of whether designating this block is a good idea for Marion. I'd ask the board to table this item, refer Mr. Reski's conflict to the appropriate authorities, and let an unconflicted board revisit it if it ever needs revisiting at all. The room was very quiet for a second, and then it wasn't. A ripple of applause started near the back and moved forward until Patricia Hall, the same hearing officer from Collins' compliance case, sitting that night simply as a resident, I later learned, had to remind everyone that outbursts weren't permitted during public comment, though I noticed she didn't sound especially eager to enforce it. The city's own law director, a measured man named Vincent Ostrander, who was sitting in on the meeting after receiving a copy of my ethics complaint and a courtesy call from Renata Cho that morning, asked to address the board directly once public comment closed. He confirmed, on the record, that the covenant issue was accurate as I'd described it, that section 14.3 did preserve it, and that the board's recommendation, as currently structured, could not lawfully proceed to a simple majority council vote, regardless of how the board itself voted that night. That single confirmation, delivered in Vincent's flat procedural tone, effectively killed the timeline Brightline had been counting on before the board even cast a ballot. Gordon tried to salvage the moment anyway, his voice noticeably tighter than it had been an hour earlier. "This is a mischaracterization of a passive investment," he said, almost word for word the line from his attorney's letter, and I'd ask the room to remember 9 years of service before drawing conclusions from one filing. It landed very differently in a packed room that had just heard the words, "did not disclose," and required by Ohio ethics law, read aloud with documentation to back every syllable of it up. 9 years of service doesn't undo a shell partnership formed 4 months before a vote that partnership stood to profit from, and I think most of the room understood that immediately, even if Gordon himself seemed to still be working it out in real time. Faye Corcoran stood up during the second round of public comment, still in her flower shop apron, and said what I think a lot of people in that room were thinking, her voice shaking slightly with an anger I understood completely. "Gordon, I've known you 15 years. I bought your wife's Christmas wreaths every December for 12 of them. I trusted you to protect this street, and you were trying to sell it out from under all of us for a stake in somebody else's development company." She sat back down without waiting for a response, and I don't think Gordon had one to give her. 2 more residents spoke after Faye, both echoing the same core point in their own words. That trust in a preservation board only works if the people on it aren't quietly betting against the neighborhood they're supposed to protect. By the time public comment closed, nearly 40 minutes had passed, far longer than these hearings usually run. The board's vote on the de-designation recommendation failed that night, 6-1, with Gordon Reske casting the only vote in favor, sitting alone at the dais in a silence that felt considerably heavier than the gavel that finally ended it. His fellow board members didn't wait long after the meeting adjourned. 2 of them approached him in the parking lot, within earshot of several residents including me, and one, a soft-spoken retired contractor named Phyllis Amonkwa who had served alongside Gordon for 6 years, told him plainly that she'd be calling for his resignation at the next meeting, regardless of what he decided to do in the meantime. He submitted his resignation letter to the city manager 11 days later, on March 1st, citing the appearance of impropriety and a desire to avoid further distraction from the board's important work, which is corporate speak, more or less. For, "I got caught and I know it, but I'll take the outcome over the wording every time." Brightline Urban Partners, facing a dead rezoning path with no realistic route around the supermajority covenant, an active state ethics investigation into their partnership with a public official, and a hostile, organized neighborhood that was no longer a quiet, unsuspecting target for shell company acquisitions, quietly began unwinding its position over the following 2 months. Diane Prescott called me once more in late March, mostly, I think, out of professional courtesy, rather than any remaining strategy. "For what it's worth," she said, "the ethics exposure alone made this untenable from a financing standpoint. Nobody wants to lend against a project with an active state investigation attached to its zoning history." I told her I understood completely, and I meant it. I've spent enough of my career around development financing to know exactly how quickly capital disappears once a project starts smelling like liability instead of opportunity. By April, Kestrel Fenwick Holdings had listed all 4 Larkspur Street parcels for sale, including the bar building, the old 5 and Dime, the vacant filling station lot, and the Fenwick Feed and Seed building, at a combined loss the Marion Star's business section, in a piece covering the collapse of the redevelopment scheme that ran with my photograph beside a shot of the Feed and Seed building's facade, estimated at approximately $2.1 million once acquisition costs, carrying costs, the abandoned feasibility study fees, and legal exposure from the ethics matter were all factored in. The reporter who wrote it, a young woman named Isla Winslow, called me for comment, and I gave her exactly the same measured answer I'd have given anyone, that I wasn't opposed to development, only to development built on a foundation of undisclosed conflicts and rerouted stormwater. She used the quote almost verbatim, which I appreciated. Colin Ashford notably stayed. His lease survived the sale of the building. The new owner, a local restaurant group that closed on the property in June, kept the anchor room's lease intact, and even helped him negotiate slightly better terms than he'd had under Kestrel Fenwick. I'll admit some grudging respect for the fact that once the dust settled, he came by one evening in late April with a 6-pack of decent local beer and left it on my porch with a note taped to the cardboard, "For the flower beds. Sorry it took me 2 arcs to learn my lesson, Colin. I don't drink much myself, But I appreciated the gesture more than I expected to, and I gave the beer to Gus Tallarico the next time he stopped by to check on the foundation repair, since he'd more than earned it. Colin and I nod to each other now when I walk past the bar in the evenings. And once, in May, he flagged me down specifically to show me a new city permit taped inside his front window for a small patio expansion, entirely on his own side of the line, surveyed properly this time, filed 3 full weeks before he broke ground. I told him it looked good. I meant that too. The through-line question I started with, back in June, standing over a stack of pressure-treated lumber with a tape measure in my hand, was simple. Could a historic corner lot's character survive being surrounded by commercial money, determined to erase it, one quiet acquisition at a time? The honest answer is that it survived because someone was paying close enough attention to notice 14 inches of encroaching decking in June and follow the thread, patiently and without much drama, all the way to a preservation board chairman's undisclosed shell partnership in February. It didn't survive by accident, and it didn't survive because the system protects old houses automatically. I want to be honest about that because I think it's the most important thing this whole ordeal taught me. The system doesn't protect anything on its own. It survived because the protections were already there, sitting quietly in county archives for decades, waiting for someone to need them. A 1994 survey, a 1971 drainage easement, a 1978 deed covenant, a 1996 recodification's 4-sentence appendix, and because somebody happened to know where to look and bothered to go looking before it was too late. The old Fenwick Historic District kept its designation, fully intact, and the City Council formally reaffirmed the boundary that spring with a unanimous vote that felt, after everything, almost anticlimactic in its ordinariness. The Fenwick Feed and Seed building is, as of this summer, under contract to a local buyer, a couple named the Ostrowskis, who grew up 2 towns over and plan to restore it as a bakery and event space, keeping the pressed tin ceiling and the original loading dock, rather than gutting it down to a decorative facade, bolted onto something new behind it. I've already told Mrs. Ostrowski I'll help however I can with the historic tax credit paperwork, because some habits, thankfully, never really retire along with the person. My foundation is dry, has been dry since December, and Gus Tallarico stops by every few months now, just to check the waterproofing out of what I think has become genuine friendship, rather than professional obligation. My property line sits exactly where the pins say it does, 14 inches wider on my side than it was in July, in the sense that actually matters, which is that nobody's still standing on it, building on it, or arguing about it. The Whitcomb house is still heather gray and cream, still mine, still on the corner it's occupied since 1891, and it will very likely outlast every LLC that ever tried to buy its way around it, the way well-built things tend to outlast the schemes assembled against them. People sometimes ask me, now that it's over, if I was angry through all of this, angry at Colin for the deck, angry at Craig Merchant for the flooding, angry at Gordon for the betrayal of 9 years of shared professional trust. I wasn't. Not really. And I don't say that to sound saintly about it, because I did feel flashes of it, especially the night I found Gordon's filing and sat alone at my kitchen table, longer than I probably should have. But anger is expensive, and it clouds your reading comprehension, and reading comprehension was the whole game here, from the very first tape measure to the very last page of a 1996 recodification ordinance. I was patient. I kept a very good binder, and it turns out that's a harder thing for a redevelopment scheme to survive than any amount of shouting would ever have been. Colin thought 14 inches wouldn't matter to an old woman with a flower bed. Craig Merchant thought a company's engineering plan mattered more than 60 years of quiet drainage infrastructure nobody had bothered to check for. Gordon thought nobody would check a shell partnership filed 4 months earlier, under a name nobody would think to search. Brightline thought a historic corner lot, and the woman living on it, were simply obstacles standing between them and a feasibility study worth millions. All 4 of them were measuring the wrong thing, in their own way, at their own scale. What mattered was never the 14 inches, or the drainage swale, or even the vote itself. It was who was still standing there, watching, patiently, with the right documents in hand, when each of those things finally moved. Marchetti still walks his dog past my porch most evenings, and he still asks, half joking, whether I've found anything new in the county archives lately. Most nights the honest answer is no, and I think we're both a little relieved by that. A neighborhood is supposed to be boring, most of the time. That's rather the point of protecting one. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and HOA/property regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice. If you've ever caught a neighbor or a company quietly encroaching on something that mattered to you, what was the first record you pulled to prove it? Tell me in the comments. And if this kind of slow burn, paper trail justice is your kind of story, subscribe for the next one.